Welcome, everyone, to our talk today. I'm Matthew Dobbs, and joined with me is my colleague, John Clark.
Hello.
All right. So we'll just jump into what we're working on today. So with our agenda, we'd like to talk about what we need to do to prepare to responding to a cyber event in a converged IT and OT universe. And first off, talk about a brief history of what Industry 4.0 is. In 1784, the first weaving loom began the Industrial Revolution. Water and steam powered systems were developed to assist plant workers with mass production of goods. This increase in production and efficiency and scale allowed small businesses to grow and begin to form what we see as bigger corporations today. And then Industry 2.0 introduced electricity into the system, and this brought the ability to really implement mass production, further streamlining all the processes in factories. And then Industry 3.0, that introduced electronics, including the first PLCs, or programmable logic controllers. This integration of electronic hardware also saw the requirement of software and firmware to enable and control these devices. In a pressure to further reduce cost, many manufacturers moved operations to low-cost countries. And this dispersion of locations gave birth to the concept of supply chain management. And then we move on to Industry 4.0. Well, with the boom of the internet and telecoms in the 1990s, it really transformed how we connected and how data and information was exchanged. This resulted in model changes in the manufacturing industry and production operations, and began to merge the borders between OT and IT, the physical and the virtual worlds. The term Industry 4.0 was first introduced at the Hanover Fair in 2011. And so we'll mostly be concentrating on, obviously, the Industry 4.0 intersection. And so next, there's a lot of reasons why the IT and OT worlds are colliding, or they're converging. There's been an increase in real-time data observation and analytics, and this real-time data processing is returning back to the factory floor to provide a positive feedback loop to enhance process efficiency. There's also taking advantage of overlapping requirements between the IT and OT fields to take advantage of unifying people and processes such as inventory control, prediction analytics, and supply chain models. And of course, in our current state of the world, remote access usage has accelerated, allowing people to work remotely where they might not have been allowed to work before. And there's also been several unintentional intersections of the IT and OT world, many cases of devices that make it to the factory floor that shouldn't have been there, plugging in personal devices in the USB ports for charging, streaming of music from HMI consoles, and even third-party vendors causing unintentional access and repercussions. So as part of this convergence, the attack surface has drastically increased. And John, will you talk a little bit about the evolution of malware?
Sure, no problem, Matt. So as Matt said, we have this massive acceleration towards Industry 4.0 and digital transformation. And we see a parallel in the malware attacks, or the increase in malware attacks, as the attack surface itself increases due to this transformation. So we have some watershed moments for ICS, and if we go back at least 10 years, we can see that Stuxnet, which everybody knows about, which was an attack on the Iranian nuclear plant, being the first also to include a PLC rootkit and targeting specific Siemens systems. Around at the time, we're using embargoed systems and in Siemens equipment, and therefore they may not have had their patches up to date on those systems, and therefore the attack was allowed to spread into that environment. In 2012, we have Shamoon. Once again, we talk about IT-OT convergence. Phishing attack gained initial access into that environment. Attackers then dropped a logic bomb, which wiped almost 35,000 systems of the Saudi Aramco plant. And then we see a little bit of a shift in 2013, and we look at the Havix malware. Not so much destructive or even disruptive. It's a more so of an espionage tool, and it's propagated via watering hole attack, specifically against ICS websites. And so once installed on the system, it would scan the environment to locate SCADA and ICS devices, and then they would send that data back to the C2 server. And then, so, like I said, it wasn't disruptive or destructive in any way, but there's no doubt that the data gathered from the Havix tool would definitely be leveraged to design and develop more destructive attacks further on. Then we move into energy, and we see black energy. Discovered in 2014 in the US, no successful disruption on the US grid. But since we talk about evolution, we talk about 2007, black energy was a distributed denial of service tool. And now we see in 2015 that it's evolved into a destructive malware causing the world's first blackout in the Ukraine. It was detected by ESET, and it was known to have multiple plugins. And we talk about this framework, this malware framework, and you could include delivery of kill disk. There's a keylogger, password stealer. You could take screenshots, network discovery, and you could even update the malware from the C2. Then in 2016, we see Indestroyer. At the time, it was believed to be the biggest threat to ICS. Once again, it's another malware framework, and is reported to have been used in the cyber attack on Ukraine's power plant again in December of 2016. The attack cut out a fifth of Kiev's power, which is the capital city of the Ukraine, for at least an hour, and it's considered to be a large-scale test. Was it said believed to be the biggest threat since ICS, since Stuxnet at the time, and it's the first ever malware that was specifically designed to attack grids. Then we go into 2017, 2018, and we look at Triton, another watershed moment, reported as the world's most murderous malware. And this is down to the fact that it was designed and built to disable safety systems, which in themselves were designed to prevent industrial accidents. It was discovered in Saudi Arabia at an unnamed petrochemical plant, and it got its name from the fact that it was targeting the Triconex industrial systems, safety systems designed and made by Schneider Electric. So with all of this, there's definitely going to be a cost. And so, Matt, do you want to talk about anything in terms of criminal focus?
Yeah, so we'll move on to that. So in 2020, it turns out that manufacturing and energy was the second most attacked industry, up 8 places since 2019, and it's only behind attacking financial services. Ransomware is the top of that attack list at 33%. So the criminals are starting to go where they know the financial payouts will be. They'll go into factory and energy and even into medical industries where they feel that the victims are much more likely to pay up the ransom to get everything back online and everything back up and running. So that attack surfaces are making it easier and easier for these criminals to target these OT systems. So now let's talk a little bit about the cost of all this malicious behavior. John, if you would like to discuss that for us.
Sure, no problem. So when we talk about cost, I say it's not always about the money. And there's definitely a people factor when we talk about cost in these attacks. So a destructive attack could no doubt result, a sustained destructive attack could no doubt result in job losses. We talk about poisoning, we're kind of going for the kind of out there scenarios where you think, is it possible? Yeah. And we see that recently where we have a close call with the Florida water treatment attack, which was possible because there was a publicly accessible port available for remote connections. And the attacker connected remotely and he raised the levels, well, I say he, but it could have been anybody. He raised the levels in the sodium hydroxide. And luckily, the plant manager noticed that it was happening and returned the system back to normal. And actually, what you see in the image on the right there is a quick search using Shodan. I could discover that there was 22,343 Modbus protocols accessible from the internet. So that's me just doing a quick search on the internet, and I could discover that all of these endpoints were accessible remotely. Then we go into 2014. We look at this blast furnace explosion that happened in the German steel mill. Spear phishing attack again. Once we see convergence of IT/OT, the attacker got access through spear phishing, was able to access the systems that were utilized for regulating the blast furnace and caused extensive damage. We also discussed previously power grid blackouts. We talked about black energy. What can happen if there was a sustained power grid attack? Hospitals' power, they run on power, so they could be shut down. We look at home medical devices, food preservation. Food could go off. People could not get food in time. If it was a sustained attack on a power grid, it could be detrimental to a society. Then we go into safety instrumented systems. We talked about Triton previously. Serious loss of life if the safety systems are compromised. The only reason that Triton wasn't successful in 2017, 2018 was because the attackers made a mistake and they actually turned on the safety system and allowed the systems to shut down safely. So they made a little bit of a mistake and the plant shut down. Nuclear reactor meltdowns, they could be possible. In 2016, a study was conducted by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and they stated that nearly half of all countries that have relevant nuclear facilities had no regulations for cybersecurity at those facilities. People, we move on to money. When we talk about money, we can see there's a number of on this list here on the slide, but I'm only going to go into maybe three of them. First, we'll talk about Duke Energy. So Duke Energy are an electric power company, and they had a fine put against them by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation for $10 million. And this was in relation to 127 violations of rules that were designed to keep US power systems safe from physical and cyber attacks. Why do I mention this? It's because imagine if any of those violations that they were fined for were exploited. Imagine the cost could have been way higher. So luckily they got caught early and they probably fixed their issues. Then we move into the year of NotPetya, which is 2017. One of the more relevant kind of situations, if we talk about today's world and how we're going through COVID, we talk about Merck Pharmaceuticals. So there was a cost of $870 million to Merck. And what happened was NotPetya had infected their systems, 30,000 plus laptops and PCs, over 7,500 servers. And they were a manufacturing facility that supplies vaccines for the US market. And that was ground to a halt. And so obviously with vaccines and COVID and rollouts at the top of the world's agenda, an attack like this right now could set a country back in their program for sure. Then we move on into one of the really more notable ones, which is Norsk Hydro, the metal and mining company, and they were commended actually for their response. The reason for that attack was the LockerGoga ransomware, and the ransomware LockerGoga blocked the company's systems, forcing them to switch to manual operations, and they actually reverted back to workarounds. They utilized pen, paper, fax machines, WhatsApp, even Facebook. So they utilized everything at their disposal, and they had a message that was transparent all the time to their clients. So what I'm going to do now actually is I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball here. And so we're going to delve into gamification. Most people may have heard about it. Not a lot of people probably know how it's utilized. So when we talk about gamification, there's definitely three areas that we want to look at first. And so one of them is games. And what are games? So games are the likes of Fortnite, Call of Duty, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. They're just kind of, I'm only naming them because they're the ones that I like to play. And so game-based learning is where a game is specifically created to teach a discrete skill or have a specific learning outcome. So it's designed to balance the subject matter and with gameplay, and hopefully the player or participant can retain that skill and apply it in a real world scenario. For instance, and actually at the time of checking, it's actually down, but Siemens had a game called Plantville, which is currently not available, and you could take control of a plant. You could do the hiring, the firing, you could do the deployment of workers, worker safety, worker satisfaction, and possibly show the ability to improve process and efficiency by purchasing and installing the equipment. And there are skills that you could utilize on a factory floor or in a plant, and that's game-based learning. And then when we talk about gamification, we're looking at application of game design elements and game principles in a non-game context. So sometimes these are defined as a set of activities and processes to solve problems by using the characteristics of game elements. So we look at scoreboards, points, badges, leaderboards, performance graphs, meaningful stories, good storyline, avatars, and teammates. So how do we apply gamification in the real world? So in the real world, we're looking at gamification from the social, the shopping, coding, education. It's all around us. It's in travel, it's in health, and psychology plays a big part of gamification. So it'll trigger emotions in us that are associated with a positive or linked to a positive user experience. It gives us a sense of control. We don't like it as humans. We typically don't like to be forced or dragged to our final destinations. It will reinforce good behavior. You think about likes on photographs and comments on different socials. It gives you a sense of achievement. You're learning to code. You're getting fit. You're learning a language. It's competitive by nature. And so are we. So setting a personal best in your health goals, for instance, you can compete against others. You look at the health, for instance, if you've got a Strava or Fitbit, you can compete against your colleagues or your friends, and then also it allows us to apply critical thinking, how we react under pressure and how we build that muscle memory going forward. And then we have maps in terms of, the ability to guide you through a game is a major part of gamification. So I talked about some of the kind of aspects of the real world, in travel, collecting air miles, shopping, collecting supermarket coupons, and in social, you go to Reddit or Facebook or Twitter, or any of those, and they've all got aspects of gamification in them. So when we talk about gamification, how do we apply it in the cyber world? So in the cyber world, we are creating tabletops. It's a scenario with a serious business impact. We have attendees and they actively respond as if it were occurring in real life. And then you would review and discuss how things went through the tabletop and then how things could have gone better. And then you can rerun that again at another time. Can be very org specific, and it's highly interactive and engaging. We talk about war games, live fire events for IT, OT, and the business teams. You can include your PR, your legal, your SOC, CISO, HR. Everybody's involved. Comms. It's like a cyber Cluedo. Are you trying to figure out who performed the attack? It's the who, what, where, when, and why. And then we have capture the flag competitions. So as we talk about this digital transformation and the convergence of IT and OT, we also need to be driving that unified skill set and language in terms of our universities and our high schools, because traditionally we would be kind of gearing towards the IT world, and preventing a threats and stuff in the IT world. But we need to kind of focus more so on driving a unified message with capture the flag. It may be difficult to influence a curriculum in a university, but providing a safe place like a capture the flag competition can be a great way of engaging and students and tech teams alike. I've built many CTFs over the years, and they're an awesome networking space where the business can learn from the students and the students can learn from the business, and it can even be utilized as a hiring tool. And then we've got a cyber range. This is the playground for all things. It's the benefits of a cyber range is very immersive, it's engaging, it's hands-on. You can inject pressure into the environment. You can set up your own use case and build around that. And the effectiveness of gamification is the fact that we learn by doing. So when we talk about to build a game or a simulation or a scenario, you need to understand who the players are and what the roles and responsibilities that they would undertake in that environment. So I think, Matt, if you want to take us into the responsibilities, that'd be awesome.
All right. So what John was saying is we need to understand who all the players in the game are. And in a complete scenario, it would include an entire business, including HR, comms, CISOs, business owners, things like that. But for today, we're just going to concentrate on the players who are the IT and the OT teams. And we also need to understand that they have totally different perspectives, or maybe not totally, but a lot of different goals, what their business goals are. For example, IT, they want to keep all the data confidential, where OT wants to keep everything running above all else, or keep everybody alive and safe. So each team has their own set of objectives, timelines, language, standards, you name it. And this can drive a wedge between the IT and the OT teams when it comes to their day-to-day activities and their long-term goals. And then also OT can sometimes see IT security as a job stopper and a job killer. Some other differences are OT needs very mature technology that they know can last 10 years, 20 years, something that's well established, where IT can have a little leeway and do, cutting edge technology, even, looking for open source solutions and things like that, where OT absolutely they can't do. And these types of differences can be exacerbated in the time of a cyber crisis. And this is where gamification can help us identify and ultimately remedy the functional and philosophical differences between these teams. And in the game, you would try and involve the entire business as part. But once again, we're just going to talk about the IT and the OT teams. And so, John, will you talk to us a little bit about setting up the game?
Sure, no problem, Matt. So as Matt said, the different perspectives of who our players will be, and how do we go about setting up the game for these. So like with any scenario, we need to understand our people, we need to understand our process, and we need to understand our technology. And in IT and OT world, these are quite different. So we need to create our environment based around their differences and try and get them into an understanding. So how do we go about setting up the game? So we create our teams, we set them up, and we equip them with the technology. So if you think of a game like Call of Duty or Rainbow Six, I think I'm giving away my secrets here, the games I play, but you look at your loadout for a mission, everybody is working towards the same goal, or within the mission, or a win within that same mission, hopefully. What if there's a breakdown in communication? How is that going to impact the outcome of the mission? So a lot of the people, the process, and the technology information that can be gathered beforehand via an interview, or to establish the perspectives of each of the teams or individuals that are going to be involved in the event. We can also decide the goals and the structures of the teams and the event at that point. And the thing about it is, the goal is not always to find who the threat actor is. Let's uncover who did this. Although it is a great part of it, it should be much bigger than that. The goal really should be, can we find gaps in our people? Can we find gaps in our process? And can we find gaps in our technology? So when we talk about setting up a game, I'll just step in through a little a scenario or an example of what that is. So let's take the aspect of setting up the game, and we talk about budget and resource allocation. These are going to be definitely different for IT versus the OT world. They may think differently about where the budget's going to go. So one of the very first things we do when we're setting up the game is you allocate some funds, and you decide between you as a group where the resources and where the money's going to go. So are we going to invest in our security personnel? Are we going to invest heavily in training, technology, or more? And so what we do then is, how much is the difference between the IT and the OT? You got to choose your path. Are you going to buy? Are you going to build? Are you going to deploy your solutions? So you could set up the game with a budget, and depending on where it's allocated, it could impact the outcome based on the decisions you make previously. So this is how we would set up the game. Matt, do you want to talk to us about how the game plays out?
Absolutely. So next, we would talk about response procedures and how that maps to playing the game itself. So understanding the response procedures from the different organizations is, just like we had mentioned, from their perspective, it's different. IT can respond to an outage by simply rebooting or reinstalling or arming a device to get a system back up. They probably even have well-established backup and recovery processes that they can schedule a maintenance window on a, Saturday night and practice these types of scenarios. But OT has a lot less opportunity to perform such tasks or have that easy of an ability to remediate any sort of situation like that. And then responding to the cyber incidents, this difference can be magnified. If there's incident forensics data needed on an IT system, it's relatively easy to get a snapshot of the hard drive and then re-image the system. But in an OT world, there may not be a way to gather that data for forensics analysis, or there's pressure to get the factory floor back up and running. Just reload the firmware and let's get go, and you lose that important bit of information. And so IT and OT teams are constantly putting out fires. It's what they do in their day-to-day operations. If somebody loses a laptop or it doesn't boot, there's well-established procedures for doing that. And then practicing a response plan is a lot like a fire drill. You need to know where the fire extinguisher is. You need to know where the exits are. You need to know what the exit plan is. But when a fire turns into a disaster, you need more than just the firefighters. You need EMTs, you need police, you need hazmat, you need all of these teams to come together and fight the disaster and recover it from it. And it's very similar in the IT and OT as well as business roles to have this sort of this dance that they perform effectively to respond. So everybody needs to know, when you're in a disaster zone or a cyber disaster, teams need to know what their jobs are. They need to know what other teams' jobs are. They need to have effective communications, or else everybody's just kind of got to get in the way of each other and potentially make the disaster any worse. And then, so John, if you want to talk a little bit about, how mapping can help out as part of gamification.
Sure. So as Matt briefly touched on there, he talked about the run book and the playbook, and that is like a map or a guide in your response plan, as to how you would deal with a certain situation. And like in any game, for instance, like Call of Duty or Fortnite, or playing without a map or a heads up display is pretty tough, I would say, in terms of, what's the next objective, where is the weapons, where are my colleagues? So we utilize a run book similar to how we would a map or a HUD in a game. So you've completed a task and you need to get to the next location. What's the path? In a response, you complete a task and the run book may dictate what the next course of action is. In a game or a simulation, it's okay, because you can make a wrong move as long as we're learning from those mistakes that we make along the way. And in cyber simulations, like, we should fail, and we should fail often, and we should find our gaps. And so the path in a game or in real life, it's not always a straight line, and there will be roadblocks, and we need to utilize your critical thinking to change the path or to move the obstacles out of the way, and all the while training your muscle memory. And so a run book is basically like your guide map to get through and navigate a scenario. And also there's other maps that you utilize, and we talk about, like, it may also be beneficial for you to map your environment with the MITRE ATT&CK framework for ICS. And so once we have our setup and our players and our maps, what are our objectives and what are our tools, Matt, that we're going to utilize as we go forward?
So today we're going to talk about security visibility. Each organization has their own very specific set of tools, their people, their process, and technology. So from a high level overview, we'll talk about security visibility that encompasses all of those things. And so, you've got your OT teams, your IT teams, your security teams, as well as your CISO, your CSO, and the other technical leaders within the organization. And as part of this, this visibility through the game, you'll find out, do you have the visibility everywhere that you think you do, that you need? help share what those risks are amongst the team, especially if you have a risk-based security policy. And as part of that game, we're showing how we can effectively do that between all of these different teams that are playing this game. Like I said, what are the risks? How do they share the data? And how do they communicate? And now, so for the game to be successful, there needs to be repeatability in order to identify and remediate any of these gaps identified. And John, if you'll talk about that for us.
Sure, no problem. So as Matt said, there needs to be a repeatability of each scenario or each session. And that way you can identify and remediate any gaps in your people, your process, or your technology. And so that's possible through the building of a simulation with a specific use case in mind. And that may be something that you feel like is really high up on the agenda for your organization and that you're concerned about the most. So you would build out a sandboxed environment that would replicate as realistic an environment as possible or as is feasible. And then you would run, you would test, and you would recycle again. So you're basically training the player, and you may even want to change the game at some point, to kind of put a little bit of a curveball. And so the goal here really is to test different aspects of the teams. So you want to be looking at your threat hunting, your analytical skills, you want to be looking at adaptability in a scenario, critical thinking, the usage of tools to complete tasks, an aptitude of a participant. And this is the place to fail and to make mistakes, to fail early and to fail often. And like we always say, you can observe, but don't let your first worst day be in the real world during a real event. You need to allow yourself to have numerous worst days in your build up to an actual real worst day. So if we combine all of this together, what have we got? So we have identified a use case to simulate something that's associated with your organization. We have, for instance, it could be ransomware on a HMI. The attack has come through the IT to OT. So we're talking about that convergence again, and how do we get the messaging going between the two teams? We need to identify the tools to play the game. Matt talked about security visibility. Do we have security monitoring in that environment? What kind of tools do you have on your OT side of the house? We identify our players. So we talked about security is an organizational issue and not just for IT. So we need a fusion team in there. We need our IT, our OT, our comms, our legal, and then we need to practice the communication between all of these teams. More specifically on IT and OT, because they don't really speak the same language at the moment. It's very vendor-based, protocol for OT. IT is very open source biased technology, cutting edge, moving with the times. And then we need to practice communication between IT and OT and the business to deliver that unified messaging. And once again, we talk about exercising the muscle memory. We need to fail early, fail often. And so the goal of the game really is to have the business practice their own processes and technology and to find gaps and edge cases that they didn't anticipate during the design and implementation phases of their security architecture. And yeah, it's great to have the game and you also get bonus points if you find a threat actor. But really what we want to do is test people, the process and the technology and find those gaps in our setup. And so Matt, I think if you want to quickly drop into our conclusion.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as the introduction of these new technologies, particularly edge computing, cloud resources, industrial Internet of Things, and especially 5G technologies, making it to the factory floor are absolutely accelerating this convergence. And with this convergence, the threat actors will also pivot and take advantage of these changes. And we see where gamification is the fun and effective way to keep pace with the future needs of the security and the business in a converged IT/OT enterprise. And John, you want to talk about some takeaways for us?
Sure. So what we want you to take away from what we've just spoken about. So definitely next week, if you haven't already done this, you should definitely do some kind of lunch and learn with your IT/OT teams. Get them talking, get them, discussing issues that they're having in their environments. Get them trying to talk, get them connected with each other, and get them connected with each other quickly. You know, it needs to be a virtual exchange between these two worlds. And then further on down the line, maybe in the first 3 months following from this, we want to see people design and create a tabletop experience. You discussed it previously, you know, pick a business problem and build it around that, and then test, find the issues, and then maybe go back again and visit it again. Involve all perspectives of the business, both IT and OT, make in all of these journeys. And then maybe further on down the line, you need to request some budget for further training and simulations like a cyber war game, or you may want to build a capture the flag event, or more tabletops. And then within 6 months, you should definitely be practicing organization policies and procedures within these simulations. Test out your governance, you know, checking the risk on both teams, you know, and you need to stress test your run books, definitely within this for 6 months. Otherwise, you, like I said, you don't want your worst day or your first worst day to be in the real world when it actually happens. That's it for me, Matt. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, everybody else. And at this moment, we'll take questions. And thank you for participating.